But you'll see what these two terms mean. Um, it is now time to proceed to the next slide.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Ryan McLaughlin. I sure do appreciate y'all taking the time out to take a look at my presentation here. I hope you'll find it very interesting and, at the very least, thought-provoking. So here we have the title of the paper is called Conspicuous Conservation and Conspicuous Giving. Now, some of these two terms may sound familiar, at least the conspicuous part. You're probably thinking of conspicuous consumption, which is a term the famous economist Veblen came up with, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later on. But these are kind of my modern takes on some modern versions of conspicuous consumption that I think are going on, and so with the help of some other colleagues, I've relabeled them, giving them new names, kind of just to make it a little bit sexy and a little more catchy. But you'll see what these two terms mean. It is now time to proceed to the next slide. Thorstein Veblen was a well-known Norwegian-American economist. He invented the term conspicuous consumption, which is why we study him today. Veblen and I share the same birthday, which my stats teacher thinks was probably a coincidence. He was asked to leave from nearly every major university he ever taught, either because he was too smart that his head simply couldn't fit through the door of the institution, or he slept with all of his dean's wives unapologetically and continuously refused to publish any sort of literature the entire time he worked there. Quite a guy. It is now safe to continue to the next slide. Veblen came up with a lot of creative and, in my opinion, really stellar language to describe some phenomenon that actually is fairly commonplace, but he uses words that are kind of confusing. So we'll just break down that a bit for you. You've heard this word conspicuous consumption before. That's one of my very favorites. So we're going to have to talk about that. Conspicuous consumption essentially means when you're taking your income or your wealth or your status, and you're using that to weaponize that in a public setting, usually through your clothes. So when you wear a nice cashmere sweater over and beyond the sake for your own need to keep you warm, if you're wearing something so that other people can see you wearing it, so that they know you've, let's say, worked hard or inherited in some way, but you've done something good to deserve this clothes. And so you want to show it off. Of course you do. And so people that indulge in this tendency compulsively, these are your conspicuous consumers. And Veblen was very critical of this conspicuous consumption because he thinks it leads to a whole heap of problematic aspects of our society, mainly the pursuit of wealth above and beyond of what we actually need. At least that's how I interpret it these days, and that's how this paper, the tone of this paper, certainly will be emphasizing that. It drives consumption, and it makes people bad for not consuming. That's another thing. Conspicuous leisure, that's another similar thing. It's not referring to clothing as much as it is to free time. Conspicuous means out there in the open. It means very upfront and visible. Conspicuous leisure is, say, someone of an upper class is on a nice holiday, but they're not just on a nice holiday in the woods by themselves. They're on a nice holiday where they also invite a bunch of nice people to see them at their nice holiday. So it's very conspicuously enjoying your leisure. It's You're using it as a status symbol. And Veblen, at a time when he's writing about these things, this was 1899 when he published his most famous book, The Theory of the Leisure Class. He really came down hard on these guys. He's like, this is wasteful, and you're alienating anyone who can't be like this, which is almost everybody, every human living on Earth. So cut it out. Conspicuous waste, I think, is another funny one. The example I give of that is a very common behavior of rich people is that when they buy a brand new pair of socks, y'all know this feeling. You buy a pair of socks, you don't wash them first, God no. You put them on, you get that nice elasty brand new sock feeling, and then after you're done with it, you just throw them in the bin. You don't recycle them or anything. That's conspicuous waste. So Veblen, it started to get to him after a while, and anyway, it is now time to proceed to the next slide. All right, now before I continue, I should make a little caveat that I'm not anti-clothing in general, nor anti-fashion. I think people do work hard. I work hard myself. I think y'all should look good in however way people want to look. But there still is the undeniable fact that fashion can be wasteful. And Veblen was very attuned to this. The example I really enjoy giving is, y'all know Burberry, which is this tartan print I put in the center of the slide. It's a very famous English print. It's been around for, I'm sure, 100 years or more. It's traditionally worn for scarves, but you'll see it in pants, jackets, suits. I actually have a knockoff face mask of it now, thanks to the COVID-19 coronavirus. May save my life. But anyway, Burberry is a particular target of those that are critical of consumer wastefulness, like conspicuous consumption. It turned out there was a report in 2018 that Burberry didn't sell as much of their overpriced clothing as they were planning. So to what they did to preserve their integrity of their brand, at least that's what was their CEO's reasoning, was instead of either donating it to some charities, some poorer off folk that could have used an ego boost by some designer clothing, that might have been a nice thing to do. Instead, they rented a warehouse in the middle of London and just burned the giant pile of surplus clothing, $36 million of high fashion. Just burned it in a very public way, rather than have their brand be diluted. So I just thought that was interesting. And it is now time to continue to the next slide. Well, you're obviously going to have to read the whole paper if you want to know how the story ends. But here's kind of how I see it beginning. This is humankind in America. This is our relationship with clothing at the time, which would have been around the turn of the century, 1900 for Veblen. Okay, so in Veblen's time, you could tell very easily from far away, not even using the binoculars or anything like that. You could just tell just by looking at someone as you walk by on the street who was a millionaire and who had literally zero money. I mean, it was that distinct. There was not much of a middle class in terms of garments, right? because they didn't make as many products, and they didn't make middle grade stuff. So clothing was very expensive. It was made to last. It was made out of imported materials, which was everything unless you lived in a cotton plantation. So yeah, a lot of work went into making your clothes. So to have nice clothes, only the very wealthy did. This seems obvious, right? But there was a giant inequality gap between the rich and the poor, as there still is. But it was especially how would you put it? It was especially distinctive when you would look at a person. And Veblen was not a fan of that either. He thought even before pre-advertising and television, that this was doing a harmful effect on society. In his own writing, Veblen refers to concepts or products as Veblen goods quite a bit. And what he's talking about there, all he's talking about is a Veblen good is something that's very fancy, built to show that you have something nice and your friend does not. A great example would be a yacht. If you live next to someone with only a 16-foot boat. Or a boss that pulls into the same parking lot as everyone else does for work, but has a special reserved spot for his Beamer, and everyone else is parking in the same lot next to the same car, but in there however they commute, right? So Veblen good is a distinctive good that sets you apart from others, and that's all. They could take the form of watches, they could take the form of gardens, and each generation, each moment in time has their own. He wrote a lot about New England wealth and traditional British wealth, but you can certainly use your imagination. These Veblen goods are still everywhere you look. Think about how your favorite sports star spends their money. Unless they're some awesome charitable dude like my man Donovan Mitchell, they're probably engaging in some consumption of Veblen goods. It is now time to move on to the next slide. All right, well, since we're on the topic of Veblen goods, and for the purposes of our arguments, we're going to be using clothes as a lot of our examples, and you may be wondering, how can clothes hurt people, Ryan? Veblen came up with a fancy word for that too, and he called this effect Invidious Distinctions, and it's very important. This is really the heart of the problem. Invidious distinctions are, it's kind of the tendency to accumulate goods simply and solely for the fact that others cannot have them to enjoy for themselves. So, getting things so only you can use. Children do a lot of this behavior, but for our purposes, I'm really referring to things more like big game hunting, like the kind of person that will go out to shoot a very endangered rhino or the last elephant on Earth, or have it what you will, just so you can't, for no other reason. The meat may not be particularly palatable, the fur may be unusable, etc., etc. Just invidiously displaying it so you can't, if that makes sense. And, once you come to the conclusion, like I have, that having something just so other one can't have it is problematic, it is now time to move to the next slide. All right, I want y'all to pay special attention here, because here's where it starts to get pretty cool. All right, guys. It should really come to no surprise, honestly, in the last few, I was just giving y'all the historical background. It should come to no surprise that Rich people wear rich clothes and it makes them happy. Okay, and they do that so that they can show how rich they are and how poor everyone else is. That's been going on for forever of time. Okay, this income inequality gap through clothing. But what's really cool is I think that is shrinking. And it's the rich people driving that shrinking, and they don't even know it. And it's shrinking through the advent of what we call athleisure. And this is the kind of clothing that you buy at REI or backcountry.com or Black Diamond, if you want a local example. Outdoors clothing. It used to be very unstylish in the 1990s and almost non-existent outside of specialty climbing shops in the Swiss Alps beforehand. But we're talking about, yoga pants would be a great example. People are buying yoga pants in huge numbers, and that certainly fits into the category of clothing that I'm talking about. And they're still expensive. But the cool thing that's happening now is that this is becoming the mandatory uniform of the upper class. So whereas in the past it had previously been maybe 100 years ago, you'd see a white woman from New England, well-to-do, shopping exclusively at Prada or Christine Dior or any other of the famous fashion houses of the era, right? But now that lady with that same income is equally likely to be shopping at the same mall as you are, or as I am, buying stuff right off the rack, pret-a-porter, as they say in French, because they want that same style. These clothes just happen to be comfortable, and I don't know if I'm doing a great job of explaining that, but the fact that rich taste is becoming Hi guys, it's me. Sorry I trailed off there on that last little slide. It's just that the implications of this are so astounding it almost puts you into a sense of stupor. The fact that these formerly upper middle class consumers are shopping at the same stores in the same malls as everyone else now really represents a shift in conspicuous consumption, and it represents a kind of a reduction in that income inequality gap. As superficial as that may be, the clothing gap at least is narrowing in a very real sense. It used to be that for the difference, you see $3,000, let's say, for a nice Prada boots, and I could only afford a $100 pair of shoes. Now they may be wearing a $200 pair of pants, and I might be able to come at least a little closer to affording that, right? It's shifting, and I hope that makes sense. You kind of need to visualize the mathematics there. But anyway, this slide I think is important as well. Conspicuous consumption, not just the East Coast anymore. Ignore that little sarcastic title. It's everywhere, not just the East Coast. The East Coast is just kind of, where this phenomenon invented with the country clubs and the whatnot. But conspicuous consumption really is a worldwide phenomenon. But the methods and mechanisms that gave rise to all the negative parts of it, like the competitive buying and the weaponization of fashion and all these things about clothing that really tear our society apart, I've been noticing some really cool things that these same things have been doing. So recently you've noticed that during coronavirus, and we're talking about conspicuous giving right now, which works in the same way. A lot of basketball players and athletes from other professional sports since they no longer can compete in their traditional ways, they've started in very public ways, in the same way that you would publicly drive your new Lamborghini. They're publicly hoarding, with their various financial resources, publicly hoarding personal protective equipment like isopropyl alcohol and gowns and gloves, and making big conspicuous displays of donating it to charities in need. And it's that same behavior which they previously were doing just with their clothing, which is now having a tangible benefit to society. And unfortunately, it took an emergency for that to happen, but it's cool. So conspicuisms can shift, and I'm sure Veblen would be overjoyed. I included conspicuous conservation on this list as well. That is something that just kind of made me laugh. I think that we don't really know where that's going yet. That trend could either be have some real planet-saving potential, or it could just be the same old, let's see how much better than the neighbors we can be fact is traditional conspicuous consumption. And what I'm talking about here when I'm talking about conspicuous conservation, and this is a very long slide, so enjoy my font that I picked out here. Back when the Toyota Prius, a hybrid car, came out, well, at the very same time, another brand of hybrid car came out, and this was the Honda Insight, nearly identical technologically. They both had wide efficiency standards, high miles to the gallon, and all the other things that petroleum consumers look for when they're buying a new car. The only difference was the Prius, which ended up selling much, much better, looked dramatically different than a normal vehicle. It was also twice the price. So when you showed up to your driveway with a Prius, your brand new Prius, not only do you tangentially support the environment, you also have this big, shiny, awesome new car that advertises that you support the environment much more so than your fellow environmentalists who bought the Insight, right? And so, not surprisingly, because conspicuous consumption does work, they sold 100 million Priuses, probably more, and no one ever talks about the Insight these days. So I just kind of thought that was amusing. So even environmentalists aren't immune, although, you have to think they might think a little bit better. But, well, thank you so much for indulging me. I think it is ready for the next slide.